I walked into the boardroom that morning the way I had walked in 100 times before. Steady steps, folder under my arm, coffee in hand. I had built that room. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. The contracts on the walls, the clients whose names were framed in bronze, the entire direction of Vale & Company had been shaped by my decisions over 6 years. My name was Selena Vale. I was 31 years old, the firstborn, the one who had given everything to this company when it was barely surviving. So when my mother, Isabella, sat at the head of the table that morning with her hands folded and her expression unreadable, I did not feel afraid. I felt ready. Whatever update she had called us in for, I was prepared to handle it. Then she spoke. She said the company was being transferred to Adrian, effective immediately. She said it plainly, almost gently, like she was telling me the weather. She said the business needed a man at the helm, that it was not meant for a woman, and that I should be proud to support my brother in his new role. The room went completely silent. Across the table, Adrian smiled. Not a warm smile. A slow, satisfied one. I stood up from that table without raising my voice. I would not give any of them the satisfaction of watching me break. My hands were trembling at my sides, but I kept my face even, my steps measured, and I walked straight out of that boardroom without looking back at my mother or my brother. The employees in the hallway knew something was wrong. I could feel their eyes following me. Some of them had been with the company since before Adrian had ever shown any interest in it. They had watched me build client lists, sit through midnight calls, and handle crises that would have collapsed a weaker person. And now they were watching me walk out of my own boardroom. I made it to the corridor near the stairwell before I stopped and pressed my back against the wall. I breathed. I focused. I did not cry. Then I heard footsteps behind me. It was Marcus, one of the senior managers who had been in the company for 4 years before I even arrived. He had been at the meeting and had slipped out quietly right after me. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he held out a folder. His voice was very low. I took the folder home that evening and spread everything across my kitchen table. It took me almost 3 hours to go through it all. There were contracts I had never seen, emails between my mother and the company's legal team that had been sent months before that morning's meeting, and financial statements showing movements I could not account for. The transfer had not been a sudden decision. Isabella had been planning it for a long time, quietly, carefully, making sure the paperwork was in order before she ever said a word to me. The documents showed that the business registration had been altered, with Adrian's name inserted as primary director without any formal board vote or documented shareholder approval. But the part that made my hands go cold was buried near the bottom of the stack. There were 2 sets of financial records from the same quarter, each showing different numbers. Funds had moved between accounts in ways that did not match the official statements. I was not sure yet whether it crossed a legal line, but it was murky enough that someone needed to look at it properly. I sat at that table for a long time after I finished reading. I was not panicking. I was thinking. His name was Theo Anand, and he had worked with me for 3 years before leaving to start his own small consultancy. He was meticulous, trustworthy, and he had no loyalty to Adrian or Isabella. When I called him the morning after reading the folder, he picked up on the second ring. We met at a coffee shop 2 days later, and I showed him what I had. He went through every page carefully, unhurried. When he finished, he leaned back and said he had suspected something was off even before he left the company. Then he showed me something he had already been sitting on. 3 months earlier, Adrian had signed off on an investment decision involving a property development partner that had already defaulted on 2 other contracts in the industry. The numbers Theo had tracked showed the investment was almost certainly going to fail. It was not just bad judgment. There were questions about whether the right disclosures had been made before the board approved it. If that deal collapsed the way Theo expected, Adrian's signature would be at the center of it. Nobody else had approved it. Nobody else had pushed for it. It had been entirely his call. I said nothing publicly for 3 full weeks after the boardroom meeting. I did not call a lawyer yet. I did not confront my mother. I did not send a heated email to the board or speak to the press. I went quiet. I let Adrian enjoy the attention that came with his new title. I let my mother believe that I had accepted it, that I was stepping back graciously the way she had expected me to. From the outside, I looked like someone who had been hurt and had simply moved on. From the inside, I was mapping every weakness in their position. Legal weaknesses first. The transfer had been done without a formal shareholder vote, and the company bylaws required one for any change in primary directorship. That alone was worth exploring. Financial weaknesses second. The mismatched records and the Adrian-approved investment were both threads that could unravel something significant if pulled at the right moment. Reputational weaknesses third. The board members who had not been consulted, the employees who had watched me work for years, the clients who had built relationships specifically with me, all of these were people whose perception of the company's leadership would matter. I kept a notebook. I wrote everything down. About 4 weeks after the boardroom meeting, Adrian held a company-wide event to formally introduce himself as the new chief executive. He had arranged media coverage. There were reporters from 2 business publications, a photographer, and a small crowd of employees who had been encouraged to attend. I went. I sat near the back and watched him present slides about the company's future, his vision, his leadership approach. He was confident in front of a camera and comfortable with attention, which I had always known. What he was not was careful with numbers. As he shared the financial overview for the last quarter, I noticed immediately that 2 figures did not match the internal reports I had seen. The revenue projection he quoted to the press was higher than what the actual statements showed. It was not a small rounding error. It was a deliberate difference. He either did not know the real numbers or he did and chose to present something more flattering to the cameras. Either way, it was the kind of discrepancy that investors and auditors take seriously when they find it. I did not react visibly. I sat in my chair with my expression calm and my notebook closed in my lap. I made the appointment with the corporate lawyer under a different name. Her office was in a building across the city, far enough from anyone who might recognize me walking in. Her name was Adiz Okonkwo, and she came highly recommended by Theo, who had used her once for a contract dispute. I walked her through everything I had. The transfer documents, the missing shareholder vote, the financial records, the investment concerns. She listened without interrupting, reading as I spoke, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. When I finished, she sat back and looked at me directly. She said there was something worth pursuing. The company's own bylaws were explicit on the requirement for a documented shareholder vote before any change in primary directorship. If that vote had never taken place, the transfer could be legally challenged on procedural grounds. The burden of proof, she said, would fall on the company to show that the correct process had been followed. And based on what I had shown her, she did not believe they could produce that documentation. She warned me it would not be instant. It would take careful preparation. But she said the legal thread was real. It was not a long shot. 8. I arranged a quiet dinner at my apartment with 3 board members I trusted. Not the full board. Just 3. Constance Yu, who had been on the board since before my mother handed me the company. Felix Drum, who had joined 2 years in and had never once questioned my leadership. And a third, Nadia Osei, who had been brought in during our expansion phase and had seen firsthand what I had built. I laid out what I knew, carefully and without emotion. I showed them the bylaw requirement. I showed them the gap in the paperwork. I did not show them everything yet. I held back the financial records and the investment concerns because I wanted to give them enough to think about without overwhelming them before I was fully ready to move. They were cautious. I had expected that. Constance said she was not willing to act against Isabella openly without seeing more. Felix said he needed time. Nadia was the most direct. She said she believed me, that she had always found the transfer strange, but that she needed to be sure she was not walking into a situation that would damage her own position. I told all 3 of them the same thing. I was not asking them to act yet. 2 weeks after the dinner, I began leaking selected documents anonymously to key people inside the company. Not everything. Carefully chosen pieces. A copy of the financial discrepancy between the public presentation and the internal report. A redacted version of the property investment approval that Adrian had signed. I sent them through a secure, untraceable method and addressed them to 4 employees who I knew talked to other people and who I knew cared about the company's financial health. I did not include my name. I did not include any explanation. I let the documents speak on their own. Within 4 days, I could feel the shift. People in the hallways were quieter. Conversations stopped when managers walked past. Someone had printed one of the documents and left it on the break room counter, where it sat for an hour before someone took it away. I heard through a contact that Adrian had been unusually short with his assistant that week and had asked for a full accounting of who had access to the internal financial files. He was unnerved. He did not know what was circulating or where it had come from. And that uncertainty, I knew, was already doing its work. A person who is panicking makes mistakes. I began attending company meetings again during the 5th week. Not as a challenger. As a neutral presence. I told Adrian and Isabella that I wanted to remain engaged, that I cared about the company's health, and that I hoped we could find a professional arrangement. They believed me. Or rather, they wanted to believe me because it was convenient. My presence gave the illusion of family harmony, which was something Isabella cared about, especially with the media attention Adrian's announcement had drawn. So I sat in meetings and said very little. I listened. I watched Adrian's body language when financial questions came up. He shifted in his chair. He redirected conversations. He answered vaguely when precision was called for. He did not understand the company the way I did, and the more I watched, the more it showed. One afternoon during a quarterly review, he misquoted a client contract figure by a significant margin. Nobody corrected him except me, very gently, citing the right number from memory. He stared at me for a moment. Then he moved on quickly. After the meeting, I saw him pull aside his assistant and speak to them in a low voice. He had noticed. He was starting to understand that something was different. But he did not yet know what it was. About 6 weeks in, Isabella organized a formal luncheon for company stakeholders. She stood up and gave a speech about the company's new direction under Adrian. She spoke about family values, about legacy, about the importance of strong leadership. Then she mentioned me. She called me supportive, loyal, and gracious in my acceptance of the transition. She said the company was lucky to have a daughter like me, one who put family above personal ambition. People applauded politely. I smiled and nodded from my seat. Across the table, Adrian looked pleased. I picked up my glass and took a sip. I thought about the folder on my desk at home, now 3 times as thick as it had been the day Marcus handed it to me in the hallway. I thought about Adiz Okonkwo's last message, confirming she had identified 2 additional procedural gaps in the transfer documentation. I thought about the property investment, which Theo had told me that morning was performing even worse than projected. And I smiled back at my mother, warmly, the way a loyal and gracious daughter would. Loyalty, I had learned a long time ago, is only a virtue when it runs both ways. Theo contacted me 10 days before the scheduled board meeting with news about the property investment. The development partner had missed a second payment deadline and was in informal talks about restructuring its debts. Theo's assessment was that the investment would be formally written off within 2 quarters, and that when it was, the loss would be substantial enough to require explanation to the board and possibly to auditors. He had also found something else. The board approval minutes from the meeting where the investment had been greenlit showed that the risk assessment presented to the board had been incomplete. 2 key financial flags had been omitted from the summary Adrian had shared. Whether by accident or design, the board had approved the investment without the full picture. At the upcoming board meeting, Adrian planned to propose a merger with a mid-sized competitor. I had reviewed the merger terms and found they contained clauses that would transfer certain liabilities to Vale and Company in ways that contradicted the company's existing obligations to its shareholders. In other words, approving the merger as written would violate the fiduciary duty the board owed to the people who had invested in the company. Adiz had confirmed this in writing. I had it documented. The meeting was 12 days away. The board meeting began the way they always did. A roll call. A review of the previous minutes. Adrian opened with a confident summary of the company's recent performance, the numbers polished to their most favorable presentation. Then he moved into the merger proposal. He spoke well. He had clearly prepared and probably rehearsed, because his delivery was smooth and his energy was controlled. He described the merger as a growth opportunity, a chance to expand the company's reach and protect its market position. Several board members nodded. Then Adrian asked if there were any initial thoughts before he moved into the detailed terms. I raised my hand. He looked at me for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before nodding. I spoke calmly. I said I had reviewed the merger terms and wanted to raise a structural concern for the board's consideration. I explained, in plain and specific language, that certain liability clauses in the agreement would conflict with the company's existing shareholder obligations. I cited the relevant clauses by number. I cited the relevant shareholder agreement provisions by section. I said I was not opposing the merger in principle, only flagging that the terms as written required significant revision before approval could be considered responsible. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Constance leaned forward and asked Adrian to clarify how the liability transfer in Clause 7 would interact with the existing shareholder protections. Adrian answered. It was not a bad answer, but it was not precise enough, and Constance followed up with a second question that required a level of detail he clearly did not have at his fingertips. Felix Drum joined in, asking about the due diligence timeline. Nadia Osei asked whether external legal counsel had reviewed the specific clauses I had flagged. Each question was measured, professional, and rooted in exactly the concerns I had quietly raised with each of them over the previous weeks. I had not told them what to say. I had simply given them the information they needed to ask the right questions on their own. Adrian was answering, but his rhythm had broken. He was checking his notes more frequently, his earlier confidence replaced by something tighter and more careful. Twice, he glanced toward my mother, who was seated at the far end of the table as an observer. Isabella's expression was composed, but I could see the slight tension in her jaw. She had not expected this. She had expected her loyal, gracious daughter to sit quietly. 15. 2 days after the board meeting, Adiz filed the formal legal challenge to the transfer. She submitted it to the company's registered legal address and to each board member individually, as required under the company's dispute resolution bylaws. The document was precise and thorough. It detailed the missing shareholder vote. It cited the exact bylaw provision that required one. It noted the absence of any documented approval in the company's official records. And it formally requested that the transfer be suspended pending a full procedural review. Adrian received his copy that afternoon. I was not present when he read it, but Theo told me later that Adrian had called 3 different people within the first hour, including the company's retained legal firm, which had apparently been caught off guard by the filing's specificity. They had not expected it to be as well constructed as it was. That evening, my mother called me. She asked what I was doing. Her voice was controlled, but underneath it was something I had not heard from her often. She sounded uncertain. I told her I was doing what any shareholder would do when proper process had not been followed. I said it calmly. She said we should talk. I said I was available whenever she was ready. A week after the legal challenge was filed, a woman named Petra Voss contacted Adiz directly. Petra had been project director on a major client account 3 years earlier, one of the largest contracts Vale & Company had ever secured. She had left the company 18 months ago over a disagreement with a middle manager but had maintained quiet respect for the work she had done while she was there. Petra told Adiz she had detailed documentation from her time on the project, including emails and signed approvals that showed every key decision had been made or directly overseen by me. She said she had watched what was happening at the company from the outside and felt the record needed to be corrected. Adiz brought her in and took a formal statement that same week. Petra also mentioned something I had not known. During the handover period, Adrian had quietly tried to claim credit for that large client relationship in conversations with potential new investors. He had described it as a deal he had personally helped develop. Petra had been a direct witness to the opposite being true and was prepared to say so clearly. When her statement came before the board, the members who had been hesitating began to look at Adrian very differently. 10 days before the investor meeting, I passed a sealed envelope to a journalist I had met through a professional contact 2 years earlier. She worked for a business publication with a serious readership and a reputation for careful, evidence-based reporting. Inside the envelope was a copy of the internal memo that had circulated before the property investment decision, the one where the risk flags had been omitted. I had redacted everything that identified the source. The journalist called me 2 days later on a number she did not know was mine. She asked careful questions. I answered none of them. I said only that the document was genuine and verifiable and that she should request a comment from Vale and Company's communications team. She published a brief but pointed piece 4 days later. It did not name Adrian directly but described a business of Vale and Company's profile as having approved a significant investment without complete risk disclosure to its board. It noted that investor confidence in the company's current leadership was reportedly being questioned internally. The piece was shared several dozen times within the business community by the following morning. I saw it mentioned in a group message between 2 of our external investors. Nobody connected the piece to me. Adrian came to my apartment on a Tuesday evening without calling ahead. I heard the knock and opened the door to find him standing in the hallway in his work clothes, his jacket slightly wrinkled, his expression somewhere between angry and frightened. I stepped back and let him in. He sat down without being invited to and told me he knew what I was doing. He said I was undermining him, leaking documents, working with board members behind his back, and trying to destroy something that had been fairly given to him by our mother. His voice was tight. He was holding himself together, but barely. I let him finish. Then I looked at him and said, very quietly, "You're undermining yourself." He stared at me. I did not raise my voice or add to it. I did not explain what I meant or list the ways it was true. I just let the sentence sit there between us. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. Then he told me I should be careful. I said I was always careful. He left about 10 minutes later. As I closed the door behind him, I felt no satisfaction in the exchange. Only clarity. He was scared. With 5 days left before the investor meeting, I worked almost without stopping. Adiz had organized the legal documentation into a clean, logical sequence. Theo had finalized his financial analysis, including a written summary of the property investment's deteriorating condition. Petra Voss had signed a formal statement that Adiz had notarized. I had the original folder Marcus had given me, the financial discrepancy slides from Adrian's media event, and the bylaw provisions highlighted and cross-referenced with the transfer documents. Everything was indexed. Everything had a date. Nothing in the dossier was speculative. Every single page could be verified independently by anyone who asked. On the 4th day before the meeting, my mother arrived at my apartment. She did not call ahead either. She sat across from me in my living room and looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said she thought I had accepted the decision. I said I had understood the decision. She asked if there was a difference. I told her yes, there was a very large difference, and that she would see it clearly in a few days. She looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. She left without saying much more. The investor meeting was held in the company's main conference room on a Thursday morning. 8 external investors were present, along with the full board and several senior managers. Adrian arrived early and set up at the front of the room with his presentation loaded and ready. He looked polished. He had clearly prepared carefully for this one, knowing the stakes were higher than usual. The legal challenge was not public knowledge yet, but the news piece and the internal rumors had created an atmosphere of quiet scrutiny that had not been present at his earlier appearances. He greeted the investors warmly, shook hands, poured coffee, and made small talk with an ease that I admired even now. He was good at the performance of confidence. When the meeting was called to order, he opened with a strong summary of the quarter. The numbers he cited were cleaner this time, more carefully aligned with the actual statements, which told me he had been coached. He moved into his agenda items methodically. And then, about 40 minutes in, the meeting moderator noted that Selena Vale had requested time to present additional material to the board and investors. Adrian looked up from his notes. Our eyes met briefly. Then I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I set my materials down without rushing. I thanked the board and the investors for the time. Then I began. I started with the ownership records, the original company registration in my name, the 6 years of directorship filings that showed my role as primary decision-maker, the signed client agreements that bore my signature on behalf of the company. I put each document on the screen one at a time, named it, dated it, and moved to the next. Then I moved to the contributions record, a detailed timeline I had compiled with Theo showing every major initiative, contract win, and growth milestone the company had achieved, each linked to the decisions and actions that had produced it. Then I laid out the financial discrepancy between what Adrian had presented to the press and what the internal reports actually showed. I presented Theo's analysis of the property investment, including the missing risk flags and the current state of the asset. I presented the bylaw provision requiring a shareholder vote for a change in primary directorship, alongside the confirmation that no such vote existed on record. I presented the formal legal challenge that Adiz had filed. And finally, I presented Petra Voss's signed statement. When I finished speaking, I stepped back and asked if there were questions. There were many. The investors went first. They were precise and professional, the way people who manage large amounts of money always are when they sense something has gone wrong. One asked Adrian directly about the property investment risk disclosure. He answered. It was not enough. Another asked about the shareholder vote requirement and whether the company's legal team had flagged the procedural gap before the transfer was finalized. Adrian looked toward the company's retained lawyer, who had been sitting against the wall. The lawyer said very carefully that the matter was under review. That was not the answer investors wanted. I watched Isabella from across the room. She had sat down sometime during my presentation and had not stood up again. Her expression had changed gradually from composed to something quieter and more uncertain. She had known I was capable. She had simply never believed I would do this. I had always known she saw me through the lens of what she expected a daughter to be, and that lens had never been wide enough to see what I had actually built or how precisely I could move when I had to. The room kept asking questions. Adrian kept answering. After the formal meeting broke up, Adrian found me in the corridor outside. The investors had moved into a private discussion with the board, and the hallway was briefly empty except for the two of us. He looked different from the man who had knocked on my apartment door a week earlier. That man had been frightened but still defiant. The man in front of me now was simply exhausted. He spoke quietly. He asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted the company returned to proper governance, beginning with the formal acknowledgement that the transfer had not followed required procedure. He said he understood that. Then he asked if there was a way this could end without a full public exposure of everything I had presented. I looked at him for a long moment. I said he had two choices. He could resign from the directorship voluntarily, with a statement acknowledging the procedural error, and the financial details would remain within the board's internal review rather than becoming public. Or I could continue with the full legal process, which would make everything on record accessible. He did not answer immediately. He looked down at the floor. Then he said, quietly, that he had not meant for things to go this far. The board meeting to formally address the situation was held 4 days later. Adiz attended as my legal representative. Theo submitted his financial analysis as a written report to the board. Petra's statement was entered into the record. Adrian had submitted his resignation from the directorship the previous evening, accompanied by a written acknowledgement that the original transfer had not followed the company's required shareholder approval process. The board voted unanimously to reinstate me as chief executive, effective immediately. The motion also called for an internal audit of the property investment and a formal review of the financial discrepancy I had presented. My mother was present for the vote. She had the right to speak before the final motion was called and she chose not to. She sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at the center of the room rather than at me. When the vote was confirmed, she did not applaud. She did not leave immediately either. She stayed in her seat while others began to gather their things. I knew she could not challenge what had just happened. Every record was clean. Every step I had taken had been careful and documented. The ground under my reinstatement was solid in a way that the original transfer had never been. 3 weeks after the board vote, I sat in my office on a quiet Friday afternoon. The city was visible through the glass behind me, and the building felt like mine again in a way that went beyond the title on my door. The audit was underway. The merger proposal had been formally withdrawn and would be renegotiated from the ground up with proper legal oversight. 3 of the investors who had been at the meeting had since reached out to express confidence in the new direction. Adrian had taken a position with a smaller firm in a different sector. He had not spoken to me directly since the corridor conversation, and I did not expect that to change soon. My mother had called once. The conversation was short and careful on both sides. I did not know yet what that relationship would look like going forward. I was not ready to decide. What I knew was this. I had not won by being louder than them or angrier than them or more ruthless than them. I had won by being more prepared. By moving slowly when every instinct told me to move fast. By building a case so solid that by the time I opened it, there was nothing left to argue with.